The merciless summer sun beat down on the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a small frontier town nestled between rolling plains and distant mountains. Once a promising settlement during the silver boom 5 years prior, it now clung to existence like a withered plant in drought-stricken soil. The wooden buildings lining the street had long since faded from their original colors to a uniform grayish-brown, weathered by the elements and neglect. Outside the jailhouse, a crowd had gathered in uneasy silence. The spectacle drawing their attention was not a hanging or a shootout, common enough occurrences in these parts, but something that struck even the hardened townsfolk as particularly cruel. Sarah Mitchell stood with her head held high despite the tears streaming down her face. At 32, grief had prematurely lined her once beautiful features, though nothing could dim the fierce protective light in her eyes as she clutched her children to her sides. Thomas, her 12-year-old son, attempted to match his mother's dignity, his jaw clenched tightly to prevent it from trembling. 8-year-old Emma made no such effort, sobbing openly as she clung to her mother's skirts. "Please," Sarah's voice cracked as she addressed the man standing before her. "The children have nothing to do with this. Let them stay with Mrs. Jenkins until I've worked off the debt." Augustus Blackwell adjusted his expensive vest, seemingly uncomfortable in the heat, but unwilling to remove his formal jacket despite the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. As the town's banker and primary creditor, he was accustomed to being disliked, but the murmurs from the crowd suggested that today's proceedings had pushed beyond the townsfolk's normally passive resentment. "Mrs. Mitchell," Blackwell said, his voice carrying the affected refinement of an Easterner, "your husband borrowed against your farm with the full knowledge of the consequences should he fail to repay. The fact that he chose to die before settling. His account is unfortunate, but hardly my concern." A ripple of outrage passed through the crowd. Sarah flinched as if struck. "My husband did not choose to die, Mr. Blackwell. The fever took him same, as it took half the county last winter." Sheriff Wilson shifted uncomfortably beside Blackwell, his weathered face suggesting he found the whole business distasteful. "Ain't there's some other way to handle this, Augustus? Taking a widow and her young uns to debtor's prison seems mighty harsh." Blackwell's thin lips formed something approximating a smile. "The law is quite clear, Sheriff. Mrs. Mitchell owes the bank $500 plus interest. Without that money or property of equivalent value, she and her dependents are legally bound to work off their debt through service." "Service?" Thomas suddenly spoke up, his young voice cracking with emotion. "You mean slavery?" "Mind your tongue, boy," Blackwell snapped. "This is a legally binding contract your father signed." He held up a paper with elaborate script. 1 year of service for the 3 of you should settle the account, provided you work diligently. Sarah pulled Thomas closer, silencing him with a gentle squeeze of his shoulder. "Where will we be taken?" she asked, her voice now steady despite her tears. "I have arrangements with a mining operation in Dakota Territory," Blackwell replied. "They're always in need of workers' women for the cookhouse, boys for the smaller tunnels." Emma's sobs grew louder at this, and several women in the crowd openly wept. Men removed their hats, a gesture typically reserved for funerals. Sheriff Wilson shook his head. "Those mines ain't no place for children, Augustus. You know that as well as I do. The contract doesn't specify the nature of the service, only that it must be provided," Blackwell replied coolly. "Now, I suggest we proceed with the transfer. The stage to Dakota leaves at noon." Just as Blackwell motioned for his 2 hired men to approach the family, the crowd parted at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. All eyes turned to the lone rider making his way down the main street. The stranger rode a magnificent black stallion that seemed barely winded despite the dust caking its flanks, suggesting a long journey at considerable speed. The rider himself was tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by the wide brim of his hat. He wore a long duster coat despite the heat, and the practiced way he dismounted spoke of a man accustomed to life in the saddle dot as he stepped into the space. Between Blackwell and the Mitchell family, the crowd fell completely silent. Even Emma's. Sobs quieted to hiccuping breaths as she stared up at the imposing figure. "What seems to be the trouble here?" the stranger asked, his voice low and raspy, as if unused to speaking. Sheriff Wilson stepped forward. "This is a private legal matter. Stranger, best you move along." The man lifted his head slightly, revealing piercing blue eyes in a sun-weathered face marked by a scar running from his right temple to his jaw. He studied the scene, the weeping woman, the defiant boy, the terrified little girl before his. Gaze settled on Blackwell. "Doesn't look private to me," he observed. "Looks like the whole town's involved." Blackwell straightened his already rigid posture. "This woman and her children are being lawfully remanded to work off a debt owed to my bank. It's a simple business transaction. Is that so?" The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly as he glanced at the paper in Blackwell's hand. "Mind if I see that contract?" Before Blackwell could object, the stranger plucked the document from his grasp with surprising speed. He scanned it quickly, his expression unreadable. $500, he finally said, plus interest at 12% per annum since February. That would make it $560, give or take. Blackwell seemed impressed despite himself. "You have a head for figures, sir." The stranger reached into his duster and pulled out a leather pouch. "I have a head for recognizing a vulture when I see one." He tossed the pouch to Blackwell, who caught it reflexively. The distinct clink of gold coins was unmistakable. That should cover the debt in full. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth in disbelief. Blackwell opened the pouch, his eyes widening slightly at the contents. This appears to be sufficient, but nothing." The stranger interrupted. "The debt is paid. The lady and her children are free to go." Sheriff Wilson stepped forward, his face showing the first genuine smile of the day. "Well now, that settles it according to the law. Mrs. Mitchell, you and your children are no longer bound by this contract." Blackwell's face flushed red. "This is highly irregular. I demand to know who you are, sir, and what interest you have in this matter." The stranger ignored him, turning instead to Sarah. "Ma'am, I believe these people. We're about to take something that belongs to you." He took the contract from Blackwell's unresisting hand and offered it to Sarah. "I suggest you keep better track of your papers in the future." Sarah stared at the stranger, her eyes searching his face as if trying to place him. "Why would you do this? You don't even know us." For a moment, something like pain flickered across the man's features. "Let's just say I've seen too many children forced into situations they didn't choose." He tipped his hat slightly. "Name's Ethan Cole." "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she replied, her voice still trembling with emotion. "These are my children, Thomas and Emma." She hesitated, clearly struggling to find adequate words. "Mr. Cole, I don't know how we can ever repay such kindness." "No need for repayment," Ethan said simply. He turned to remount his horse, apparently considering the matter closed. "Wait," Thomas suddenly called out. "Where will you go now?" Ethan paused, one foot in the stirrup. "Hadn't given it much thought. Just passing through, I suppose." Sarah took a tentative step forward. "We don't have much, Mr. Cole, but we have a roof and a hot meal to offer. It's the least we can do." The crowd had begun to disperse, their excitement fading now that the drama had concluded. Blackwell, after verifying the contents of the pouch, retreated toward his bank with as much dignity as he could muster. His hired men following sullenly behind Dot, Ethan seemed to consider Sarah's offer, his eyes moving from her determined face to the hopeful expressions of her children. For a moment, it appeared he might refuse, but then his shoulders relaxed slightly. I could use a decent meal, he admitted, and my horse could use some rest. Relief washed over Sarah's face. Our farm is about 3 miles east of town. It's not much to look at these days, but I'm sure it will be fine, Mrs. Mitchell. Ethan interrupted gently. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Wilson approached Ethan, speaking in a low voice. Mighty generous thing you did there, Cole. Don't believe I've seen you in these parts before. Just passing through, Ethan repeated, his tone making it clear he wasn't interested in further conversation. Wilson nodded slowly. Well, just so you know, folks around here have long memories for kindness and for trouble. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving the implied question about Ethan's past hanging in the air. The journey to the Mitchell farm was quiet, with Emma riding in front of Ethan on his stallion, while Sarah and Thomas walked alongside. The little girl had quickly overcome her initial shyness, peppering Ethan with questions about his horse, his travels, and anything else that came to her curious mind. Ethan answered with patience, if not elaboration. His responses typically limited to a few words. As they crested a small hill, the Mitchell farm came into view. It was immediately clear that the property had seen better days. The small farmhouse, though structurally sound, needed paint and repairs. The barn, structurally sound, needed paint and repairs. The barn leaned slightly to one side, and the fields that should have been planted lay mostly fallow, with only a small garden plot showing signs of cultivation. It's not much, Sarah said softly, noticing Ethan's appraising gaze. After James, my husband, died, I couldn't manage it all. We sold most of the livestock to cover expenses. Just have a few chickens and 1 milk cow left. Ethan nodded without comment, but his eyes took in every detail of the neglected property, with a thoughtfulness that suggested he was seeing more than just the present state of disrepair. As they approached the house, Emma wiggled to be let down, and ran ahead to the porch, where she was greeted by an elderly border collie that rose stiffly to meet her. That's Patch, Thomas explained. He's old, but he still keeps the foxes away from the henhouse. Ethan dismounted and helped Sarah down from the wagon they'd borrowed in town. Where can I see to my horse? The barn has empty stalls, Sarah replied. Thomas can show you. I'll start on supper. She hesitated, then added, Mr. Cole, I know you said no repayment is necessary, but I need to understand. Why would you help strangers with such a substantial sum? Ethan met her gaze steadily. Sometimes a man just needs to do the right thing, Mrs. Mitchell. No more explanation required. Before Sarah could press further, Thomas tugged at Ethan's sleeve. Come on, Mr. Cole. I'll help you with your horse. In the barn, Thomas watched with undisguised admiration as Ethan efficiently unsaddled and groomed his stallion. What's his name? The boy asked. Midnight, Ethan replied, running a brush along the horse's gleaming coat. He's the finest horse I've ever seen, Thomas said. Were you a cavalryman in the war? A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips. You ask a lot of questions, boy. Pa always said I was too curious for my own good, Thomas admitted. Then his face clouded. Pa's been gone almost 6 months now. Ma tries to keep things going, but it's hard. He looked around the dilapidated barn. Mr. Blackwell's been trying to take our farm since the day Pa was buried. Ethan's hands stilled momentarily. On the brush. Is that so? Thomas nodded vigorously. Pa always said Blackwell was trying to buy up all the land around the creek because he knows something others don't. Ma thinks it's just talk. But, Thomas, Sarah's voice called from outside. Wash up for supper. The boy looked regretfully at Ethan. I gotta go. But will you teach me about horses while you're here? Please? We'll see, Ethan replied, which was enough to send Thomas running from the barn with newfound excitement. Left alone, Ethan finished tending to Midnight before extracting a small leather-bound journal from his saddlebag. He flipped through it until he found a particular page, studying a hand-drawn map with notations in the margins. His finger traced a line marked Redemption Creek before moving to a circled area labeled Mitchell Property. "Right where you said it would be, William," he murmured to himself. "Now to find out if the rest of your letter was true as well." He closed the journal and tucked it away as he heard Emma's voice calling him to supper. For a moment he remained motionless, his expression troubled. Then, with a deep breath, he straightened his shoulders and headed toward the farmhouse, where warm light spilled from the windows into the gathering dusk dot inside. The Mitchell home was modest but clean, with worn furniture that spoke of better times. The table was set with mismatched dishes, and the meal Sarah had prepared was simple beans, cornbread, and a small portion of salt pork, but the aroma filled the small kitchen pleasantly. Emma had already claimed the chair next to where Ethan would sit, her small face alight with excitement at having a guest. Thomas helped his mother bring the food to the table, his movements suggesting this was a familiar routine. "It's not much," Sarah apologized as they sat down, "but it's filling." "It's more than enough," Ethan assured her. He waited as Sarah bowed her head, and the children followed suit. "Lord," Sarah prayed softly, "we thank you for this food and for your provision. And we especially thank you for sending Mr. Cole to help us in our time of need. Amen. Amen." "Emma," echoed enthusiastically Dot as they ate. Emma dominated the conversation with stories about her doll, her friends from school, and Patch's latest adventures chasing rabbits. Thomas occasionally interjected with corrections or additions, while Sarah watched her children with a mixture of love and concern. Ethan said little, but observed everything, occasionally meeting Sarah's gaze across the table with an unreadable expression. When the meal was finished, Thomas and Emma reluctantly went to their small bedroom off the main room, leaving Sarah and Ethan alone at the table with cups of coffee. "They're good children," Ethan observed after a comfortable silence. Sarah smiled fondly. "They've been through so much, but they still find joy in simple things." Her smile faded. "Today was— I don't have words to thank you properly, Mr. Cole." "Ethan," he corrected gently. "Ethan," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "I need to ask, do you expect the money back? Because I don't know when or how I could possibly—" "I told you, no repayment necessary," he interrupted. "Consider it a gift." Sarah studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Gifts that large usually come with strings attached, in my experience." Ethan met her gaze directly. "No strings. But I could use a place to stay for a few days, if that offer still stands. I'd earn my keep. Noticed your barn needs some repairs, and those fields won't plow themselves if you're planning to get a crop in this season." Hope and wariness battled in Sarah's expression. "Why would you do that? You don't know us." Ethan set down his coffee cup and leaned forward slightly. "Maybe I'm tired of just passing through places. Maybe I'd like to do something useful for a change." He hesitated, then added, "Or maybe I knew your husband." Sarah's cup clattered against the table. "You knew James? How?" "He never mentioned, and then—" "Ethan Cole." "It's a long story," Ethan said. "One better saved for daylight. But I will tell you this: James Mitchell saved my life once, a long time ago. When I heard about his passing, I thought perhaps I could help his family." "That doesn't explain the timing," Sarah pressed. "How did you happen to arrive at precisely the moment we needed you most?" Ethan's face revealed nothing. "Good fortune, I suppose." Sarah clearly didn't believe him, but exhaustion was overtaking her curiosity. "Well, whatever your reasons, my children and I are in your debt." She rose from the table. "There's a small room off the kitchen. It's not much, but the bed is clean." "It'll do fine," Ethan assured her Dot. As Sarah prepared to leave the room, she turned back. "Ethan, whatever your reasons for helping us, thank you. For the first time since James died, I think we might actually be all right. After she left, Ethan sat alone at the table for a long time, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to unasked questions. Finally, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded, yellowed letter. He read it again, though he had long since memorized its contents. Ethan, if you're reading this, then I'm already gone. I need you to do something for me, brother. Something I have no right to ask after how we parted ways. My family is in danger, though they don't know it yet. Blackwell isn't after my farm because of the debt. He's after what's beneath it. The creek that runs through our property isn't just water. There's gold, Ethan. Not enough to mine conventionally, but enough that someone with knowledge of new hydraulic methods could extract a fortune. Blackwell knows. He's been buying up all the properties along the creek, one by one. I've held out, but my time is running short. This winter sickness is taking me, and when I'm gone, he'll find a way to take everything from Sarah and the children. I know you have no reason to help me after what happened in Willow Creek, but I'm not asking for myself. I'm asking for 2 innocent children and a good woman who doesn't deserve what's coming. Your brother always. James Ethan folded the letter carefully and returned it to his pocket. His brother's final request had brought him to Redemption Creek. But seeing Sarah and her children today had awakened something he thought long dead, a sense of purpose, and perhaps something more. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and Ethan found himself wondering if perhaps he had finally found a place to stop running from his past. If you're enjoying this gripping Western tale of redemption, please like and share. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. Dawn broke over the Mitchell farm with a palette of pinks and golds that belied the hardships of frontier life. Ethan was already outside, assessing the property in the early morning light. Years of neglect were evident everywhere he looked, but the bones of a once prosperous homestead remained. The creek that gave the town its name ran along the eastern edge of the property, its waters catching the sunrise in flashes of brilliance. Ethan knelt beside it, scooping up a handful of silt from the bottom and examining it closely before letting it filter through his fingers back into the flowing water. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he stood and surveyed the surrounding land. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't notice Thomas approaching until the boy was standing beside him. Ma says breakfast is ready, Thomas said. Were you looking for gold? Some of the boys at school say there's gold in Redemption Creek, but Pa always said that was nonsense. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Did he now? What else did your pa say about the creek? Thomas shrugged. Not much. Just that Blackwell was a fool for thinking there was anything valuable here besides water for the crops. He kicked at a stone. Not that we've had much of those lately. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Well, your pa was a smart man in many ways. They walked back to the house together, where the aroma of frying bacon greeted them, a luxury Ethan suspected. Sarah had prepared specially for her guest. Emma bounced in her chair as they entered. Mr. Cole, I saved you the seat by me again. Sarah turned from the stove, her hair caught up in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. In the morning light, with a touch of color in her cheeks from cooking, Ethan could see the beauty that grief had temporarily dimmed. I hope you slept well, she said. The children and I have chores to tend to after breakfast, but please feel free to rest. You've done more than enough for us already. Ethan accepted a plate of bacon and eggs. Actually, I thought I might take a look at that barn. Roof won't make it through another winter in its current state. I couldn't ask you to. You're not asking, Ethan interrupted gently. I'm offering. Besides, idle hands never suited me. After breakfast, Sarah and Emma went to tend the chickens and garden, while Thomas was assigned to help Ethan with the barn. The boy proved to be a willing if inexperienced assistant, handing tools to Ethan and asking an endless stream of questions about everything from carpentry to where Ethan had traveled. "Were you really friends with my pa?" Thomas asked as they worked on reinforcing the barn's support beams. Ethan paused, a hammer suspended mid-swing. "In a manner of speaking." "What manner is that?" A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips. "You really don't let up, do you?" At Thomas's unrepentant grin, he continued, "Your father and I knew each other a long time ago, before he met your mother." "Were you in the war together?" "Something like that." Thomas seemed to sense he wouldn't get more information for now, and changed tactics. "Will you teach me to shoot while you're here?" "Ma won't let me touch Pa's rifle. Says I'm too young." "Your mother's right," Ethan replied, resuming his work on the beam. "Guns aren't toys." "I know that," Thomas said with the exasperation only a 12-year-old could muster. "But Pa always said a man needs to know how to protect his family, and I'm the man of the house now." Ethan stopped working entirely and turned to face the boy. "Being a man isn't about guns, Thomas. It's about responsibility, taking care of those who depend on you, making hard choices and living with the consequences." His voice had taken on a gravity that made Thomas stand straighter. "Your paya would be proud of how you're helping your mother. That matters more than handling a rifle." Thomas absorbed this with surprising thoughtfulness. "But someday I'll need to know, won't I?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Someday, but not today. Today, we fix this barn." He handed Thomas a nail. "Hold this steady and don't move your fingers." By midday, they had made significant progress on the barn's repairs. Sarah brought them water and sandwiches, her eyes widening at the transformation. "This, I never expected ... double quotes," she began. "It's not finished," Ethan said, wiping sweat from his brow, "but it's a start." Sarah's expression softened. "It's more than that, Ethan. It's hope." She hesitated, then added, "Sheriff Wilson rode out earlier, while you were working. He wanted to speak with you, said he'd be back this evening." Ethan's face remained impassive, but his shoulders tensed slightly. "Did he say what about?" "No, but he seemed concerned rather than troubled." She studied him for a moment. "Is there something I should know?" "Nothing that need worry you," Ethan assured her, though the tightness around his eyes suggested otherwise. After lunch, Ethan sent Thomas to help his mother while he rode the property boundaries on midnight. He paid particular attention to the creek, dismounting several times to examine the water and surrounding soil. At one point, he extracted his journal and made notes, his expression thoughtful. As he crested a hill overlooking the farm, Ethan noticed a rider approaching from the direction of town. The man's straight-backed posture and glinting badge identified him as Sheriff Wilson, even at a distance. Ethan watched for a moment before guiding Midnight down to meet him. The two men met on the road leading to the farmhouse, out of earshot of the main buildings. "Sheriff," Ethan acknowledged with a nod. "Cole," Wilson returned the greeting. "Doing a property survey?" "Just getting the lay of the land. Mrs. Mitchell has her hands full with those children and a farm this size." Wilson studied him thoughtfully. "That's mighty generous of you, considering you just happened to be passing through." Ethan met his gaze steadily. "Something on your mind, Sheriff?" Wilson reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded telegram. "This came in yesterday from the marshal's office in Santa Fe. Seems they're looking for information about a man matching your description." He unfolded the paper. "Tall, blue eyes, scar on right side of face, rides a black stallion. Sound familiar?" "Could describe a lot of men," Ethan replied evenly. "Indeed it could," Wilson agreed. "But how many of them would be carrying enough gold to settle a $500 debt on the spot?" He refolded the telegram and returned it to his pocket. "They don't say this fella's wanted for anything, just that they're seeking information." "About his whereabouts?" Care to tell me why the law in Santa Fe might be looking for you? Ethan's expression revealed nothing. Perhaps you should ask them. Oh, I intend to, Wilson assured him. But I thought I'd give you the courtesy of hearing. Your side first. On account of what you did for the Mitchell family. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ethan sighed. I was a deputy marshal in Santa Fe until 2 months ago. Left after a disagreement with the new marshal about how certain matters should be handled. Wilson raised an eyebrow. A disagreement that led you to ride out without notice? Some disagreements can't be resolved with words, Ethan replied. I see. Wilson considered this. And the gold? Payment for services rendered during my time. As deputy. Nothing illegal about it. The sheriff nodded slowly. Well, I've no cause to doubt you, and God knows we could use a man with law experience around here. Blackwell may have backed down for now, but he's not one to let go of something. He wants. He gestured toward the farm. And for some reason, he wants this land something fierce. Ethan's expression sharpened. Has he bought other properties along the creek? Everyone he could get his hands on, Wilson confirmed. Paid good money, too. More than they were worth by local standards. Only the Mitchell place has held out, and not for lack of trying on Blackwell's part. Interesting, Ethan murmured. Wilson watched him closely. You know something about this creek that the rest of us don't, Cole? Just speculation, Ethan replied. But I'd keep an eye on Blackwell if I were you. Men like him don't invest without expecting returns. The sheriff nodded thoughtfully. I'll wire Santa Fe back. Tell them I've got no information to share at present. But Cole, his voice took on a warning tone. If there's more to this story than a simple disagreement, I'd rather hear it from you than a telegram. Understood, Ethan said, and appreciated. As Wilson rode away, Ethan remained on the hilltop, watching until the sheriff disappeared from view. Only then did he turn midnight toward the farmhouse, his expression troubled. He found Sarah in the garden, kneeling in the dirt as she weeded between rows of young vegetables. She looked up at his approach, shielding her eyes against the afternoon. Son, was that Sheriff Wilson I saw riding away? She asked. Ethan nodded, dismounting to join her. Just checking in. Sarah gave him a look that suggested she didn't quite believe him, but wouldn't press for now. The children are excited you're staying for dinner. Emma's already planning where everyone will sit. Ethan smiled despite himself. She's a force of nature, that one. Like her father, Sarah said softly, returning to her weeding. James always filled any room he entered. Thomas is more like me, watches, thinks, feels everything deeply. Ethan knelt beside her, surprising her by taking up a trowel and skillfully removing a stubborn weed. At her raised eyebrow, he shrugged. My mother kept gardens wherever we lived. She believed the earth would always provide if you treated it with respect. A wise woman, Sarah said. After a moment, she added, Will, you tell me how you really knew James? I've been thinking about it all day, and I don't recall him ever mentioning an Ethan Cole. Ethan worked in silence for several moments before responding. He wouldn't have. When we knew each other, I went by a different name. Sarah's hand stilled. What name? Ethan met her gaze directly. Ethan Mitchell. Her eyes widened in shock. Mitchell? Are you saying James was my brother? Ethan confirmed quietly. My older brother. Sarah sat back on her heels, staring at him in disbelief. James never spoke of a brother. Not once in all our years together. I'm not surprised, Ethan said, his voice tinged with old pain. We parted on bad terms. 15 years ago. What happened? Sarah asked, her initial shock giving way to curiosity. Ethan returned to his weeding, his movements precise and controlled. The usual things brothers fight over. Land, money, different. Views of the world. He paused. We both said things we couldn't take back, and you never reconciled? The sorrow in Sarah's voice was evident. I tried once, about 7 years ago. Tracked him to a town in Colorado, but he'd already moved on. Ethan's jaw tightened. Pride is a powerful thing, Mrs. Mitchell. It kept me from trying again until it was too late. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. Does this mean you're the children's uncle? Thomas and Emma have family they never knew about? The question seemed to catch Ethan off guard. I suppose it does. Why didn't you tell us immediately? Why all this mystery about just passing through? Ethan set down his trowel. I wasn't sure how I'd be received. James's letter found me 2 months ago, after bouncing between post offices for months. By then, he was already gone. His voice softened. I wasn't sure what right I had to claim family ties after so many years of silence. Sarah studied his face, seeing for the first time the subtle resemblances to her late husband, the shape of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the intensity of his gaze. James wrote to you? Before he died? Ethan nodded. Asked me to look out for you and the children. Said you were in danger, though I didn't understand the full scope until I saw Blackwell ready to haul you all off to those mines. What did the letter say, exactly? Ethan hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew the worn letter, offering it to Sarah. She took it with trembling hands and read it slowly, her expression changing from confusion to concern to determination. Gold, she whispered when she finished. James thought there was gold in our creek? That's why Blackwell wants our land? It appears so, Ethan confirmed. And after riding the property today, I think James was right. There are signs of gold deposits, not the kind that cause a rush, but enough that someone with the right equipment could extract significant wealth over time. Sarah looked toward the creek, barely visible from their position. All this time, I thought Blackwell was just being cruel, trying to take advantage of a widow's hardship. But he's been planning this for years. Her eyes flashed with sudden anger. While my husband lay dying, that man was calculating how to steal our land and the gold beneath it. Ethan was struck by the transformation grief and weariness temporarily displaced by righteous fury. Blackwell won't give up easily, he warned. Men like him rarely do. Neither will I, Sarah said firmly. This land is my children's inheritance, and I'll fight for it with everything I have. She looked at Ethan with new determination. Will you help us? Not just with repairs or money, but really help us fight for what's ours. The question hung between them, laden with implications. Ethan had come out of obligation to his brother, intending only to ensure the family's immediate safety before moving on. Staying meant commitment, attachment, the very things he'd avoided for years. Before he could answer, Thomas's voice called from the house. Ma, Mr. Cole, Ryder's coming. Ethan was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. As he scanned the horizon, in the distance, a cloud of dust marked the approach of several horsemen from the direction of town. Get inside, he told Sarah, his voice leaving no room for argument. Take the children to the back room and stay there until I call for you. Sarah hesitated only briefly before nodding and hurrying toward the house. Ethan strode to meet the riders, positioning himself between them and the farmhouse, one hand resting casually near his weapon dot as the riders drew closer. Ethan recognized Blackwell at the lead, accompanied by the same 2 hired men from town and 2 others he hadn't seen before. All were armed, though only Blackwell's men had their hands near their weapons. Mr. Cole, Blackwell called as they reined in their horses a respectful distance away. I'm surprised to find you still here. I thought you were merely passing through our little community. Found reasons to stay, Ethan replied evenly. What brings you out this way, Blackwell? The banker dismounted, brushing dust from his immaculate suit with gloved hands. Business, of course. I've come with a new proposition for Mrs. Mitchell. His smile didn't reach his eyes. One I believe she find quite generous. She's not interested in selling, Ethan stated flatly. Blackwell's smile tightened. I think that decision should come from Mrs. Mitchell herself, don't you? Or do you speak for her now? Ethan was saved from responding by Sarah's appearance at his side. Despite his instruction to stay hidden, she had apparently decided to face Blackwell directly. Her chin was raised defiantly, though Ethan noticed she kept a careful distance from the visitors. Whatever you have to say, Mr. Blackwell, you can say it with Mr. Cole present, she declared. He has my complete confidence. Blackwell's gaze flickered between them, clearly reassessing the situation. Very well, Mrs. Mitchell, in light of recent events, I've decided to make you a final offer for your property. $2,000 cash. That's 4 times what your husband owed the bank, and considerably more than this run-down farm is worth in its current state. Sarah didn't flinch. This land is not for sale at any price, Mr. Blackwell. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. Blackwell's facade of civility slipped slightly. I urge you to reconsider. $2,000 would give you and your children a fresh start somewhere else. Perhaps closer to family? My family is right here, Sarah replied coolly, and we're not going anywhere. One of Blackwell's men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his holstered pistol. Ethan noted the movement without appearing. 2, keeping his posture relaxed while mentally calculating the distance to each armed man. I see, Blackwell said after a moment. Well, I had hoped to resolve this amicably. He turned to remount his horse, then paused. Tell me, Mrs. Mitchell, have you paid your property taxes for this year? They're due at the end of the month, I believe. The county assessor, a personal friend of mine, has recently adjusted the valuation of properties along Redemption Creek. I imagine your tax bill will be ... substantial. Sarah paled but maintained her composure. We'll manage our affairs, Mr. Blackwell. Good day to you. Blackwell smiled thinly as he settled into his saddle. We shall see. Good day, Mrs. Mitchell. His gaze shifted to Ethan, hardening. Mr. Cole. The riders departed in a cloud of dust, leaving Sarah and Ethan standing in the yard. Only when they were well out of sight did Sarah's shoulders sag. Taxes, she whispered. I'd forgotten about the taxes. James always handled those. She looked at Ethan with renewed worry. If Blackwell has influenced the assessor to raise the valuation ... How much were they last year? Ethan asked. $30, Sarah replied, which was manageable, if tight. But if they've increased the valuation significantly, Ethan's jaw tightened. Blackwell's playing dirty now. But he's also getting desperate. That's good to know. Sarah looked at him with surprise. How is that good? We barely have $10 to our name after winter expenses. Because desperate men make mistakes, Ethan replied. And I intend to be there when Blackwell makes his. He turned to face her fully. You asked if I'd help you fight for this land. My answer is yes, Sarah. I'll help you keep what's yours. Relief flooded Sarah's face, followed quickly by determination. Thank you. But we need a plan. Even with your help, we can't pay exorbitant taxes indefinitely. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. First, we need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Tomorrow, I'll ride into town and speak with the assessor, see what kind of adjustment Blackwell has arranged. His eyes narrowed. Then we need to find proof of what Blackwell's really after. If we can demonstrate that he's manipulating official valuations for personal gain. That would be a serious offense, Sarah finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. But how do we prove it? Before Ethan could answer, Emma came racing from the house, heedless of any potential danger. Uncle Ethan, Thomas says you're our uncle. Is it true? Her small face was alight with excitement and hope. The title caught Ethan off guard, rendering him momentarily speechless. Sarah watched him carefully, clearly curious about his reaction. Emma didn't wait for confirmation. She flung herself at Ethan, wrapping her arms around his waist. "I knew you must be family. That's why you helped us, isn't it? Because you're Pa's brother." Slowly, awkwardly, Ethan placed a hand on the child's head. "Yes," he finally said, his voice rougher than usual. "I'm your father's brother, your uncle." Emma beamed up at him. "Does that mean you'll stay forever?" Ethan met Sarah's gaze over Emma's head, something unspoken passing between them. "Let's start with for now," he suggested gently, "and see where that takes us." Emma seemed satisfied with this answer and released him to skip back toward the house, calling for Thomas to confirm that she'd been right all along. Left alone with Sarah once more, Ethan cleared his throat. "Kids adapt quickly. They've been craving family," Sarah said softly. "After James died, they felt so alone. We all did." She hesitated, then added, "I should tell you, Ethan, whatever happened between you and James, he regretted it. He kept a photograph of the two of you as young men. It's one of the few personal items he always made sure was packed whenever we moved." Ethan's expression softened with surprise and something like pain. "I didn't know that," Sarah smiled sadly. "There's a lot none of us knew. But perhaps now we can start to put the pieces together." She gestured toward the house where the children were, visible through the window, watching with undisguised curiosity. "Come inside. It's nearly supper time, and I believe you have some stories to tell your niece and nephew about their father when he was young." As they walked toward the house together, Ethan felt a strange sensation in his chest, a lightening, as if a burden he'd carried for 15 years was finally beginning to lift. He had come to Redemption Creek out of obligation to his brother's memory, but he was staying for something else entirely, the chance to be part of a family again, and he would defend that family with everything he had. Don't miss what happens next. Like and comment below to show your support for this story. Your engagement helps us create more Western tales of courage and redemption. A morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Ethan rode into Redemption Creek, the town still quiet except for a few early risers. He had left the Mitchell farm before dawn, promising Sarah he would return with news about the tax situation and any other information he could gather about Blackwell's plans. The previous evening had been a revelation for everyone. After supper, at the children's eager insistence, Ethan had shared stories of his childhood with James Taley's, of two brothers growing up on a Texas ranch, getting into mischief and learning the hard lessons of frontier life. He had carefully avoided mentioning the rift that had eventually separated them, focusing instead on the good memories. Thomas and Emma had listened with rapt attention, occasionally interrupting with questions or exclamations of surprise at hearing about their father's youthful adventures. Sarah, too, had seemed captivated, learning sides of her late husband she had never known. "Pa never told us any of this," Thomas had marveled at one point, "about how you two caught that mountain lion in a trap, or the time you rode through that flash flood." "Your father wasn't one to dwell on the past," Ethan had replied, his eyes meeting Sarah's briefly. "He was always looking forward, planning for the future." The evening had ended with a tentative peace settling over the household, a sense that perhaps the wounds of the past might heal and new bonds might form in their place. Now, as Ethan tied midnight outside the county assessor's office, he reminded himself of what was at stake. This wasn't just about righting old wrongs or fulfilling a deathbed promise anymore. It was about protecting a family that was quickly becoming important to him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The assessor, a thin man named Harley Jenkins, was visibly nervous when Ethan entered his office. He shuffled papers on his desk, avoiding direct eye contact. Mr. Jenkins, Ethan began without preamble, I understand there's been a recent adjustment to the valuation of properties along Redemption Creek. I'd like to know the specifics, particularly regarding the Mitchell farm. Jenkins cleared his throat. I'm afraid I can't discuss individual property assessments with anyone but the owner, Mr. Cole. Ethan placed a document on the desk, a hastily written authorization Sarah had provided that morning. Mrs. Mitchell has authorized me to act on her behalf in this matter. The assessor glanced at the paper, his discomfort growing. Even so, the new assessments haven't been finalized. It would be premature to cut the horseshit, Jenkins, Ethan interrupted quietly. We both know Blackwell's leaning on you to raise the valuations. I want to know by how much. Jenkins paled. I don't know what you're implying, sir, but I assure you all valuations are conducted according to county guidelines. Ethan leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. Let me be clear. I rode with the U.S. Marshals for 8 years. I've seen every kind of corruption there is, from simple bribery to complex land swindles. What Blackwell's doing here isn't new or particularly clever. His eyes hardened. Now, you can either tell me what I want to know, or I can ride to the territorial capital and request a formal investigation into the assessment practices in this county. Your choice. The threat had the desired effect. Jenkins slumped in his chair, the fight going out of him. Triple, he muttered. The Creek properties had been revalued at triple their previous assessment. Ethan let out a low whistle. $90 in taxes for a small farm like the Mitchells? That's not just inflated, it's robbery. I had no choice, Jenkins insisted. Weakly. Blackwell controls the bank, which holds notes on half the businesses in town, including my brother-in-law's general store. He made it clear what would happen if I didn't cooperate. And the other Creek properties? The ones Blackwell already owns? Jenkins looked down at his hands. Those haven't been reassessed yet. Blackwell said to wait until after he acquires the Mitchell place. Ethan's suspicions were confirmed. So only the Mitchell farm faces these inflated taxes. Convenient. Please, Jenkins pleaded. You can't tell anyone I told you this. Blackwell would ruin my whole family. Ethan considered the frightened man before him. Jenkins was a coward, but also a victim of Blackwell's far-reaching influence. I won't mention your name, he promised. But I need copies of the previous assessments and the new ones Blackwell had you prepare. Jenkins hesitated, then nodded. I can have them ready by tomorrow. But what good will it do you? Blackwell practically owns the town council. Even with proof of irregular assessments, who would stand against him? Leave that to me, Ethan replied grimly. Just have those documents ready. As Ethan left the assessor's office, he noticed increased activity around the bank across the street. Several rough-looking men he didn't recognize were unloading heavy equipment from wagons, machinery that seemed out of place for a small-town banking operation. Moving casually to get a better view. Ethan recognized hydraulic mining equipment, similar to what he'd seen during his time in California. His jaw tightened. Blackwell wasn't just planning to extract gold from the creek. He was preparing to start immediately after acquiring the Mitchell property. Admiring our new investments? Blackwell's voice came from behind him. Ethan turned slowly to face the banker, keeping his expression neutral. Unusual equipment for a bank, Blackwell smiled thinly. Diversification, Mr. Cole. Banking alone isn't enough to grow in these changing times. He gestured toward the equipment. Soon, Redemption Creek will experience a renaissance. New industry. New opportunities. Progress, Mr. Cole. Progress for whom? Ethan asked. Seems to me the only one benefiting will be Augustus Blackwell. The banker's smile didn't waver. A rising tide lifts all boats, as they say, but I forget you're merely passing through. Our town's future prosperity is hardly your concern. His eyes narrowed slightly. Though I admit I'm curious about your continued interest in the Mitchell family's affairs. Let's just say I have a personal stake in their well-being, Ethan replied evenly. Indeed? How interesting. Blackwell studied him thoughtfully. You know, Mr. Cole, you could be an asset to our operations here. A man with your experience could go far with the right connections. Certainly farther than playing nursemaid to a widow and her brats. Ethan's expression hardened. Careful, Blackwell. The banker raised his hands in a placating gesture. Merely an observation. Still, my offer stands. Should you decide your talents are wasted on that failing farm, come see me. I pay generously for loyalty. I'll keep that in mind, Ethan said dryly. As Blackwell turned to leave, he paused. Oh, and do remind Mrs. Mitchell that property taxes are due in 3 weeks. It would be a shame if such a devoted family were to lose their home over a mere financial matter. Ethan watched him walk away, mind already working on the next steps. Blackwell's confidence suggested he believed victory was inevitable. A potentially dangerous assumption that might lead to carelessness. His next stop was the sheriff's office. Wilson was at his desk, reviewing wanted posters when Ethan entered. Cole, the sheriff acknowledged with a nod. Got a response from Santa Fe this morning. He held up a telegram. Says you resigned your position as deputy marshal 2 months ago. No outstanding warrants or complaints. He fixed Ethan with a steady gaze. Though they do mention you left rather abruptly following a difference of opinion with the new marshal. That covers it well enough, Ethan replied. Wilson set the telegram aside. Good enough for me, though I suspect there's more to the story. What brings you by today? Ethan closed the door before speaking. What do you know about hydraulic mining, Sheriff? Wilson's eyebrows rose. Enough to know it's messy business. Tears up the land, pollutes the water downstream, something fierce. Why? Blackwell's unloading hydraulic mining equipment outside his bank as we speak, Ethan explained. And I've confirmed he's had the assessor triple the tax valuation on the Mitchell property while leaving his own creek acquisitions at the original assessment. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, considering this information. That's dirty pool, but not necessarily illegal. Property assessments are at the discretion of the county assessor. Not when they're selectively applied to force a sale, Ethan countered. That's fraud, which would be damned hard to prove without Jenkins testifying against Blackwell, Wilson pointed out. And we both know that won't happen. Ethan paced the small office. There has to be a way to stop him. If he gets his hands on the Mitchell farm and starts hydraulic mining, it won't just destroy their land. It'll contaminate the water supply for every farm downstream. Wilson rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. There's talk of new territorial regulations on hydraulic mining, but nothing's been passed yet. Blackwell's timing isn't coincidental. He's making his move before any restrictions can be put in place. What? About water rights? The Mitchells must have legal claim to the creek running through their property. They do, but mining law gets complicated. If Blackwell can prove there's gold in that creek, he might be able to claim mining rights that supersede water rights. Wilson sighed heavily. The law's still catching up to these new extraction methods, Cole. And meanwhile, men like Blackwell exploit the gaps. Ethan stopped his pacing, a new thought occurring to him. What if we could prove Blackwell already knows there's gold in the creek? That his whole campaign to acquire the properties isn't speculation, but based on confirmed knowledge he's kept hidden? Wilson leaned forward with interest. That would change things. Deliberate concealment of mineral findings to manipulate property values could be considered fraud. But how would you prove it? I'm working on that, Ethan said. In the meantime, I need a favor. Can you delay the tax collection on the Mitchell property? Buy us some time? The sheriff considered this. I might be able to find some irregularities in the paperwork that need clarification. Could delay things by a week, maybe 2. Not much, but it's something, Ethan acknowledged. Thank you. As he turned to leave, Wilson called after him. Cole, be careful. Blackwell didn't get where he is by playing fair. If he thinks you're a real threat to his plans, a confrontation might get ugly fast. Ethan nodded grimly. I'm counting on it. Instead of returning directly to the Mitchell farm, Ethan rode along Redemption Creek, following its winding path across properties now owned by Blackwell. He was searching for something specific evidence that Blackwell had already conducted mining operations to confirm the presence of gold. 2 hours into his search, on a remote stretch of the creek several miles from town, Ethan found what he was looking for. Hidden in a small ravine was a crude sluice box and several tools, pans, picks, and shovels showing recent use. Nearby, partially covered by brush, was a small camp that had been hastily dismantled. Dismounting, Ethan examined the area carefully. The sluice box showed traces of fine gold dust in its ridges, confirming his suspicions. Blackwell had been secretly testing the creek before making his land purchases, knowing exactly what lay beneath the seemingly ordinary waters. Even more telling was a small leather pouch Ethan discovered buried beneath the ashes of the campfire. Inside were several small gold nuggets and a folded paper with notes in what Ethan assumed was Blackwell's handwriting, detailing estimated yields per ton of soil from various points along the creek. Most importantly, the notes were dated 6 months ago, well before James Mitchell's death and the subsequent pressure on Sarah to sell. This was the evidence Ethan needed to prove Blackwell's deception. Satisfied with his discovery, Ethan carefully repacked the evidence and mounted midnight. It was mid-afternoon by the time he returned to the Mitchell farm, where he found Sarah and the children working in the newly tilled field. Thomas was guiding a plow behind their elderly mule, while Sarah and Emma planted corn seeds in the furrows. It made a striking tableau against the backdrop of rolling hills, a family fighting against the odds to preserve their home and livelihood. Something tightened in Ethan's chest at the sight, a sensation both unfamiliar and increasingly frequent in recent days. Sarah straightened as he approached, pushing back a strand of hair that had escaped her bonnet. Her face was flushed from exertion, but her eyes were bright with determination. You were gone longer than expected, she said, a hint of worry in her voice. Ethan dismounted. Had some investigating to do. Found what we need to put Blackwell on the defensive. Sarah's expression brightened with hope. Tell me. As Ethan explained his findings, Thomas left the plow to join them, his young face serious as he listened. Even Emma quieted her usual chatter, sensing the importance of the conversation. So Blackwell knew there was gold all along, Sarah said when Ethan finished. He deliberately concealed it while buying up the other properties at normal prices. And when he came to the last piece he needed, your farm James refused to sell, Ethan continued. That's when Blackwell started applying pressure through the loan. Thomas's eyes widened in understanding. And when Pa died, he thought Ma would be easy to push around. Thomas, Sarah admonished gently, though her expression suggested she agreed with his assessment. What do we do now? Thomas asked, looking between his mother and uncle. Ethan considered their options carefully. We could take this evidence to the territorial judge, but that would mean a lengthy legal battle. Blackwell has resources to drag it out for years. And we don't have years, Sarah added softly. Not with the taxes coming due. What about finding the gold ourselves? Thomas suggested eagerly. If there's gold in our creek too, we could use it to pay the taxes. Ethan shook his head. Panning for gold is slow work, son. You might find enough to supplement your income over time, but not enough to pay $90 in taxes in 3 weeks. A thoughtful silence fell over the group, broken only by Emma's voice as she bent to examine a grasshopper in the freshly turned soil. Look, she said, pointing at the insect. He's trapped, but keeps jumping anyway. Pa always said when you're trapped, sometimes you have to jump in a different direction. Her innocent observation struck a chord with Ethan. Your father was a wise man, he murmured. Then, more decisively, we need to jump in a different direction. Instead of fighting Blackwell directly or trying to pay his inflated taxes, we need to change the game entirely. How? Sarah asked. By making the gold worthless to him, Ethan replied, a plan forming in his mind. Or at least making it too costly to extract. He outlined his risky strategy that would require cooperation from other farmers downstream and possibly the support of the town council. Sarah listened intently, asking pointed questions that revealed a sharp mind behind her gentle demeanor. It could work, she finally said, but it depends on convincing people to stand against Blackwell, which few in Redemption Creek have been willing to do. Let me worry about that, Ethan assured her. For now, we should continue as if nothing has changed. Let Blackwell think his plan is proceeding unchallenged. Thomas looked up at Ethan with admiration. Like in that story you told us, about how you and Pa outsmarted those cattle rustlers by letting them think they'd gotten away with it. Ethan smiled at the memory. Something like that. As they returned to their work in the field, Sarah fell into step beside Ethan. There's something I've been meaning to ask you, she said quietly, ensuring the children couldn't overhear. In James's letter, he mentioned what happened in Willow Creek. What did he mean? Ethan's expression closed off slightly. That's a story for another time. I think I need to know, Sarah persisted gently. If we're going to trust each other, if we're going to be family, there shouldn't be secrets between us. Ethan was silent for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and controlled. 15 years ago, James and I had a claim in Willow Creek. Good one, too, not rich, but steady. We'd worked it for 2 years, had plans to build something permanent. His jaw tightened. Then a man named Delaney came along, claiming he had documentation proving he'd staked the claim first. It was forged, but the local authorities were in his pocket. What happened? Sarah prompted when Ethan paused. James wanted to fight it legally. I wanted to fight it differently. Ethan's eyes darkened with the memory. We argued. I went to confront Delaney alone, against James's wishes. Things got heated. Shots were fired. He took a deep breath. Delaney died. I claimed self-defense, but there were no witnesses. James ... James gave testimony that saved me from hanging, but afterward, he said he couldn't continue partnering with someone who would take the law into his own hands. Sarah absorbed this revelation without visible judgment, and that's when you parted ways. Ethan nodded. He headed east, I went south. Eventually, I decided to work on the right side of the law, became a deputy marshal. Thought maybe someday I'd make things right with James, show him I'd changed. His voice grew rough. Never got the chance. Sarah was quiet for a moment before responding. James never stopped caring about you, you know. Sometimes at night, he'd sit on the porch looking at the stars, and I knew he was thinking of people far away. Once, after he'd had a bit too much whiskey, he mentioned having a brother who was too quick to draw, but had a good heart underneath all that bluster. A flicker of emotion crossed Ethan's face paint, mingled with a tentative hope. Sounds like him. Always thought he knew people better than they knew themselves. He did, Sarah agreed softly. And I think he'd be grateful you're here now, helping us. She hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, I'm grateful too. Not just for the money or the work you've done, but for giving Thomas and Emma a connection to their father's family. That's something I could never provide alone. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a mutual understanding, a shared purpose, and perhaps the beginning of something neither was ready to name. The moment was broken by Emma's cheerful call, announcing she'd finished her row of planting. "We should get back to work," Sarah said, a hint of color in her cheeks as she turned away. "Daylight's wasting." Ethan watched her walk back to the children, her slender figure straight and determined despite the weight she carried. In that moment, he made a silent vow, not just to James's memory, but to Sarah and the children as well. He would see this through, whatever the cost. The following days passed in a flurry of activity. While Sarah and the children continued their work on the farm, Ethan rode throughout the county, speaking with farmers downstream from the Mitchell property. He explained the dangers hydraulic mining would pose to their water supply: silt, debris, and mercury contamination that would render the creek useless for irrigation and livestock. Many were skeptical at first, reluctant to challenge Blackwell's authority in the region. But when Ethan showed them the evidence of Blackwell's secret mining tests and explained the banker's plan to acquire all creek properties through manipulated assessments, attitudes began to shift. By the end of the week, Ethan had secured the support of 12 farming families, all of whom agreed to attend the next town council meeting to voice their opposition to Blackwell's mining plans. Meanwhile, Sheriff Wilson had made good on his promise to delay the tax collection, finding irregularities in the assessment paperwork that required review. This bought the Mitchell family precious time to implement their strategy. The night before the council meeting, Ethan sat on the porch of the Mitchell farmhouse, cleaning his revolver by the light of a lantern. The house behind him was quiet, the children asleep after an exhausting day of farm work. Only a single light burned in the kitchen, where Sarah was finishing the mending. The sound of the door opening announced her presence before she spoke. "May I join you?" Ethan nodded, setting aside his weapon as Sarah settled into the chair beside him. For a few minutes, they sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds: crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft nickering of the horses in the barn. "Thomas asked me today if you're staying permanently," Sarah said finally. I didn't know what to tell him. Ethan's hands stilled in his lap. "What would you like me to tell him?" Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious in the lantern light. "I'd like to know the answer myself, Ethan. When this business with Blackwell is settled one way or another, what then? Do you ride away, back to whatever life you had before? Or ... She left the alternative unspoken, hanging in the air between. Ethan looked out across the darkened fields, considering his response carefully. "I've been alone a long time, Sarah. Gotten used to answering to no one but myself. The idea of staying in one place, being part of a family again, is not something I planned on." "I understand," Sarah said quietly, a note of resignation in her voice. "But," Ethan continued, turning to meet her gaze, "plans change. People change. These past weeks, working this land, being with you and the children, it stirred something in me I thought was long dead." Sarah's breath caught. "What are you saying, Ethan?" "I'm saying I'd like to stay, if you'll have me. Not just as James's brother or the children's uncle, but as..." He faltered, unused to expressing such sentiments. "As someone who cares deeply for all of you. Someone who wants to build something here with you." A vulnerability in his admission hung between them, Ethan feeling suddenly exposed in a way no gunfight had ever made him feel. Sarah's eyes searched his face, as if looking for any sign of uncertainty. "The children would be overjoyed," she said softly. "They've come to love you already." "And you, Sarah?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "How would you feel about it?" Instead of answering immediately, Sarah reached out and took his hand in hers, a simple gesture that nonetheless sent a jolt through Ethan's entire being. "When James died, I thought that part of my life was over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never expected to feel this way, again, to find someone who makes me believe in possibilities rather than just obligations." Her fingers tightened around his. "Yes, Ethan, I want you to stay. For the children, for the farm ... and for me. Ethan's other hand came up to cover hers, rough calluses against soft skin. Then I'll stay. Whatever happens tomorrow with Blackwell, we'll face it together, and whatever comes after. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a rider coming fast down the road toward the farm. Ethan was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his revolver as Sarah stood beside him. The rider reined in hard at the gate, and in the dim moonlight they recognized Sheriff Wilson's familiar silhouette. "Cole," he called urgently. "We've got trouble." Ethan hurried to meet him, Sarah close behind. The sheriff's face was grim as he dismounted. "What's happened?" Ethan demanded. "Just got word from one of my deputies," Wilson replied. "Blackwell's men are loading up wagons with explosives. Word is they're planning to create a mining accident on your property tonight, Blow. The creek bank to prove there's gold and force an immediate sale under emergency provisions." Sarah gasped. "Can they do that?" "Not legally," Wilson said grimly. "But by the time the law sorts it out, your land would be ruined, and Blackwell would offer pennies on the dollar for what's left. Most likely, he's planning to claim it was just prospecting that went wrong." Ethan's expression hardened. "How much time do we have?" "Not much. They were nearly ready when my deputy slipped away to warn me. I'd guess they'll be here within the hour." "The children," Sarah whispered, fear evident in her voice. "Get them up and dressed," Ethan instructed. "Then take them to the root cellar. It's the safest place if there's trouble." He turned to Wilson. "How many men does Blackwell have?" "At least 8, all armed." The sheriff hesitated. "I've sent for my other deputies, but they're patrolling the North County. Won't be here for hours." "So it's just us," Ethan concluded grimly. Wilson nodded. "I'm afraid so." Sarah, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. "No, it's not just you. The Andersons and the Millers are just over that ridge. If we light the signal fire, they'll come. We arranged it when James was sick, in case we needed help." Ethan looked at her with newfound respect. "Do it, and grab. James's rifle, I know you know how to use it." For a moment, Sarah seemed surprised by his assumption, then nodded firmly. "I grew up on a farm, Ethan. Of course I know how to shoot." As she hurried inside to wake the children, Ethan and Wilson quickly formulated a defensive strategy. The creek bank most likely to be targeted was visible from the house, but offered little cover for defenders. Their best option was to intercept Blackwell's men before they could reach the property. "We'll set up at the bridge," Ethan decided, referring to a narrow wooden structure that crossed the creek at the property line. "It's the only way they can bring wagons of explosives onto the land." Within minutes, Sarah had lit a large signal fire on the hill behind the house and returned with James's rifle and a shotgun. Thomas insisted on staying to help defend the farm, but Ethan firmly directed him to the root cellar with Emma. "Your job is to protect your sister," he told the boy. "That's the most important task tonight." Thomas reluctantly agreed, though his expression showed he understood the gravity of the situation. As they prepared to leave for the bridge, Sarah pulled Ethan aside. "Be careful," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We've only just found each other. I couldn't bear to lose you too." Ethan touched her face gently. "You won't. I promised I'd stay, and I mean to keep that promise." The bridge was a simple wooden structure spanning the narrowest point of Redemption Creek, just where it entered Mitchell property. Ethan and Wilson positioned themselves on the far side, using a fallen tree and the natural embankment for cover. Sarah set up slightly behind them, her rifle steady in experienced hands. They didn't have to wait long. The rumble of approaching wagons soon broke the night's stillness, accompanied by the muted voices of men trying to move quietly, but hindered by their numbers and equipment. "Remember," Ethan said quietly, "we want to stop them, not start a bloodbath." Warning shots first. Wilson nodded, his expression grave in the moonlight. Let's hope they're reasonable. A first wagon appeared around the bend in the road, followed closely by a second. Riders flanked both vehicles, and Ethan counted at least 7 men, all armed as Wilson had warned. Blackwell himself was conspicuously absent. When the lead wagon was about 50 yards from the bridge, Ethan stood, his revolver raised, but not pointed directly at the approaching men. "That's far enough," he called, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Turn those wagons around and head back to town." The convoy halted abruptly, the men reaching for their weapons as they realized the bridge was defended. "Cole?" One of the men called Blackwell's foreman, whom Ethan recognized from town. "This ain't your fight. We've got legitimate mining business on this creek. Blowing up someone else's property isn't legitimate business," Ethan countered. "Sheriff Wilson is here with me. You men are trespassing with intent to destroy private property. Turn around now, and there won't be any charges." A tense silence followed as the men conferred among themselves. Then, without warning, one of the riders fired a shot that splintered wood near Ethan's head. The moment was broken by Emma's cheerful call, announcing she'd finished her row of planting. "We should get back to work," Sarah said, a hint of color in her cheeks as she turned away. "Daylight's wasting." Ethan watched her walk back to the children, her slender figure straight and determined despite the weight she carried. In that moment, he made a silent vow not just to James's memory, but to Sarah and the children as well. He would see this through, whatever the cost. The following days passed in a flurry of activity, while Sarah and the children continued their work on the farm. Ethan rode throughout the county, speaking with farmers downstream from the Mitchell property. He explained the dangers hydraulic mining would pose to their water supply: silt, debris, and mercury contamination that would render the creek useless for irrigation and livestock. Many were skeptical at first, reluctant to challenge Blackwell's authority in the region. But when Ethan showed them the evidence of Blackwell's secret mining tests and explained the bankers' plan to acquire all creek properties through manipulated assessments, attitudes began to shift. By the end of the week, Ethan had secured the support of 12 farming families, all of whom agreed to attend the next town council meeting to voice their opposition to Blackwell's mining plans. Meanwhile, Sheriff Wilson had made good on his promise to delay the tax collection, finding irregularities in the assessment paperwork that required review. This bought the Mitchell family precious time to implement their strategy. The night before the council meeting, Ethan sat on the porch of the Mitchell farmhouse, cleaning his revolver by the light of a lantern. The house behind him was quiet, the children asleep after an exhausting day of farm work. Only a single light burned in the kitchen, where Sarah was finishing the mending. The sound of the door opening announced her presence before she spoke. "May I join you?" Ethan nodded, setting aside his weapon as Sarah settled into the chair beside him. For a few minutes, they sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds: crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft nickering of the horses in the barn. "Thomas asked me today if you're staying permanently," Sarah said finally. "I didn't know what to tell him." Ethan's hand stilled in his lap. "What would you like me to tell him?" Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious in the lantern light. "I'd like to know the answer myself, Ethan. When this business with Blackwell is settled one way or another, what then? Do you ride away, back to whatever life you had before? Or—" She left the alternative unspoken, hanging in the air between them. Ethan looked out across the darkened fields, considering his response carefully. "I've been alone a long time, Sarah. Gotten used to answering to no one but myself. The idea of staying in one place, being part of a family again, is not something I'd planned on." "I understand," Sarah said quietly, a note of resignation in her voice. "But," Ethan continued, turning to meet her gaze, "plans change. People change. These past weeks, working this land, being with you and the children. It stirred something in me I thought was long dead. Sarah's breath caught. What are you saying, Ethan? I'm saying I'd like to stay, if you'll have me. Not just as James's brother, or the children's uncle, but as, he faltered, unused to expressing such sentiments, as someone who cares deeply for all of you. Someone who wants to build something here with you. The vulnerability in his admission hung between them, Ethan feeling suddenly exposed in a way no gunfight had ever made him feel. Sarah's eyes searched his face, as if looking for any sign of uncertainty. The children would be overjoyed, she said softly. They've come to love you already. And you, Sarah? Ethan asked, his voice low. How would you feel about it? Instead of answering immediately, Sarah reached out and took his hand in hers. Simple gesture that nonetheless sent a jolt through Ethan's entire being. When James died, I thought that part of my life was over, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never expected to feel this way again, to find someone who makes me believe in possibilities rather than just obligations. Her fingers tightened around his. Yes, Ethan, I want you to stay. For the children, for the farm, and for me. Ethan's other hand came up to cover hers, rough calluses against soft skin. Then I'll stay. Whatever happens tomorrow with Blackwell, we'll face it together. And whatever comes after. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a rider coming fast down the road toward the farm. Ethan was on his feet instantly, hand moving to his revolver as Sarah stood beside him. The rider reined in hard at the gate, and in the dim moonlight they recognized Sheriff Wilson's familiar silhouette. Cole, he called urgently. We've got trouble. Ethan hurried to meet him, Sarah close behind. The sheriff's face was grim as he dismounted. What's happened? Ethan demanded. Just got word from one of my deputies, Wilson replied. Blackwell's men are loading up wagons with explosives. Word is they're planning to create a mining accident on your property tonight below the creek bank to prove there's gold and force an immediate sale under emergency provisions. Sarah gasped. Can they do that? Not legally, Wilson said grimly. But by the time the law sorts it out, your land would be ruined, and Blackwell would offer pennies on the dollar for what's left. Most likely, he's planning to claim it was just prospecting that went wrong. Ethan's expression hardened. How much time do we have? Not much. They were nearly ready when my deputy slipped away to warn me. I'd guess they'll be here within the hour. The children, Sarah whispered, fear evident in her voice. Get them up and dressed, Ethan instructed. Then take them to the root cellar. It's the safest place if there's trouble. He turned to Wilson. How many men does Blackwell have? At least 8, all armed. The sheriff hesitated. I've sent for my other deputies, but they're patrolling the North County. Won't be here for hours. So it's just us, Ethan concluded grimly. Wilson nodded. I'm afraid so. Sarah, who had been listening intently, stepped forward. No, it's not just you. The Andersons and the Millers are just over that ridge. If we light the signal fire, they'll come. We arranged it when James was sick, in case we needed help. Ethan looked at her with newfound respect. Do it, and grab James's rifle. I know you know how to use it. For a moment, Sarah seemed surprised by his assumption, then nodded firmly. I grew up on a farm, Ethan. Of course I know how to shoot. As she hurried inside to wake the children, Ethan and Wilson quickly formulated a defensive strategy. The creek bank most likely to be targeted was visible from the house, but offered little cover for defenders. Their best option was to intercept Blackwell's men before they could reach the property. We'll set up at the bridge, Ethan decided, referring to a narrow wooden structure that crossed the creek at the property line. It's the only way they can bring wagons of explosives onto the land. Within minutes, Sarah had lit a large signal fire on the hill behind the house and returned with James's rifle and a shotgun. Thomas insisted on staying to help defend the farm, but Ethan firmly directed him to the root cellar with Emma. "Your job is to protect your sister," he told the boy. "That's the most important task tonight." Thomas reluctantly agreed, though his expression showed he understood the gravity of the situation. As they prepared to leave for the bridge, Sarah pulled Ethan aside. "Be careful," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We've only just found each other. I couldn't bear to lose you too." Ethan touched her face gently. "You won't. I promised I'd stay, and I mean to keep that promise." The bridge was a simple wooden structure spanning the narrowest point of Redemption Creek, just where it entered Mitchell property. Ethan and Wilson positioned themselves on the far side, using a fallen tree and the natural embankment for cover. Sarah sat up slightly behind them, her rifle steady in experienced hands. They didn't have to wait long. The rumble of approaching wagons soon broke the night's stillness, accompanied by the muted voices of men trying to move quietly, but hindered by their numbers and equipment. "Remember," Ethan said quietly, "we want to stop them, not start a bloodbath. Warning shots first." Wilson nodded, his expression grave in the moonlight. "Let's hope they're reasonable." The first wagon appeared around the bend in the road, followed closely by a second. Riders flanked both vehicles, and Ethan counted at least 7 men, all armed as Wilson had warned. Blackwell himself was conspicuously absent. When the lead wagon was about 50 yards from the bridge, Ethan stood, his revolver raised, but not pointed directly at the approaching men. "That's far enough," he called, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Turn those wagons around and head back to town." The convoy halted abruptly, the men reaching for their weapons as they realized the bridge was defended. Cole? One of the men called Blackwell's foreman, whom Ethan recognized from town. "This ain't your fight. We've got legitimate mining business on this creek." "Blowing up someone else's property isn't legitimate business," Ethan countered. "Sheriff Wilson is here with me. You men are trespassing with intent to destroy private property. Turn around now, and there won't be any charges." A tense silence followed as the men conferred among themselves. Then, without warning, one of the riders fired a shot that splintered wood near Ethan's head.